Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome, everyone. We had some technical difficulties, so we are actually live on Vimeo. And thank you all for joining today on this live webinar. We truly appreciate your time taking to be here. For all those who are new to Flexible, Flexible is a minimal framework that aims to shift left your Salesforce development. So check out your framework at flexible.io. Today on the webinar, I'm excited to have John Devlin, who we had an opportunity to work with for the last 6 to 8 months. And John did a very good job leading the recent transformation of their ALM process at Coinbase to an amazing level. So thanks, John, for sharing this with the Flexible community, and we are very much excited to have you here. So I'll
Sure.
hand over to John, and then he'll talk about his journey. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. And we can't thank you guys enough for the help along the way that assisted in this transformation. So I'll go ahead. Let's walk through. I'm going to talk through today about our journey and how it enabled us to get to a state where we're deploying with confidence multiple times a day. All right. So I think we sharing my screen. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about me first. My least favorite subject. I'm Jonathan Devlin. I'm the platform engineering manager at Coinbase. I've spent the last 10-ish years in the Salesforce ecosystem, worked for USA, Salesforce, Booz Allen, and now Coinbase, and I maintain 25 certifications on the platform. I have a personal passion for anything that's kind of code, Apex related, and just being able to deliver without friction on the platform. So let's talk a little bit about Salesforce at Coinbase. Our footprint, we've got two main orgs. We have about 5,000, a little over 5,000 users across those two orgs. And it's a highly regulated and audited environment. So all of our changes are reviewed. We are frequently subject to audit. And so we have to be able to hand over all of our change reports, change reviews, and make sure that everything we're doing is reviewed and approved. Our teams, we are a very engineering heavy company, but we still have our admins. We've got a mix of admins and developers. Our total engineer footprint, we have just a little over 60. And across this transformation, this is the type of transformation that you think about from an org perspective when you're trying to do it. Anytime you're moving to something that's more technical in nature, you get into GitHub, you get into source control, you get into CLIs. The question always comes up: how do you handle the admins in there? And the way that we did that was we set clear expectations up front that this is where we're going, this is how we're going to do it, and we made sure to encourage them along the way. Admins have the exact same problem solving skill sets that developers have. And so we just made sure to include office hours, one-on-ones, and white glove support along the way to make sure that no engineer was left behind along this journey. And with that, we kind of set up a video demo library. Anytime people were getting stuck, we threw on the screen recording, went through piece by piece, got them unstuck, and that just led to a very robust library of videos for any types of problems that people would run into. So typically, when I talk about this, I actually put this slide last, the scoreboard. I'm going to talk about it first because I want to make sure that everyone understands that this transformation led to a massive increase in productivity for our entire ecosystem internally here at Coinbase. So in 2023, I've got the results through Q2 here. Q3 just ended this year, so I haven't done a remeasurement. But for the first 6 months of this year, where we were subject to this transformation and this new framework, SFOps by Flexible, if we compare 2023, we had spent a little over 2,400 hours doing deployments. In 2024, Q1 and Q2, we spent just a little over 1,000. So we saved over 1,400 hours by switching to this framework, optimizing our metadata, and basically following all the practices that Flexible puts out. With that, the time savings is mostly around our deployment success rates. So if you look at it across all environments in 2023, first 2 quarters, we were just under 70% success rate, so not even a passing grade. 2024 this year, we were at 88.1%. So that's an 18.4% improvement there. And the most important of those deployments is actually to production. So you can see that we increased our deployment rate from 78 to 94%. That's very close to a perfect record for production deployments. Those are the most time consuming ones to get wrong. We're very, very close to having that perfect. Another piece using Flexible, you can see that our fully automated deploy rate in 2023 was at 68.6%. So that a fully automated deploy basically means anything that does not have a pre or post deploy step. When we measure that in 2024, our automated deploy rate was 82.5%. So that saves a bunch of time as well. Another important thing here, we kept our number of deploys fairly similar. You'll see a dip in 2024, but that's because the flexible framework gave us a better way to bundle some of these deployments together. So we didn't have to necessarily deploy things one at a time. We could make some really, really good bundles that actually drove our total deploys down a little bit, but we still had the confidence with it. Overall, when we adopted this framework and we basically reorganized our repos, our metadata, everything was faster, cheaper, and better by every metric that you could measure it by. So the first question we get a lot, the title of this presentation is, optimizing your metadata to deploy 10 plus times a day. Why deploy so often? There's risk with deploys. I understand that. Everyone understands that. But if you can do it with confidence, then if you can deploy more often, then each of your deploys is much smaller. So rather than stockpiling a bunch of metadata changes for days, weeks, months at a time, if you're able to deploy things in a way that you have confidence and it's a small scope, then it's less risky. On that same token, when you do a small deploy with less changes within that deploy, rolling back to it is much easier because the scope of that deploy is much smaller. SFOps in general encourages continuously breaking down the org into smaller, more modular pieces. So taking that metadata and moving it down into smaller packages, smaller domains, and we'll get into that later. But basically, it encourages you to break your org down into the smallest pieces that you can logically group together. And bringing that into the deploys, that same mindset allows you to deploy more often with confidence. And I would make the argument that when you're talking about writing the stories originally that ultimately become the work that gets built, if you can't deploy them often, there's not a real value in breaking those stories down because you're still having to stockpile them at some point and do these large deploys, which have more risk. So if you can deploy something small, then there's actual value in writing a story that's small because you could write it, do it, complete it, and then move on to the next thing. You're not having to keep track of things in various states of, is it dev complete? Is it testing complete? Is it ready for release? And we're just waiting for the next release in the next day, month, whatever. And I would also make the argument that engineers thrive by completing things. As a lifelong engineer, I can say that it's very challenging to keep my work in different buckets of done. So I have something that I'm working on this sprint. I've completed it from a dev perspective, and now I'm waiting for testing. And maybe I have some stories that were done last sprint, and now they're sitting in UAT, and I'm having to keep track of the findings that is coming from that. And maybe I have some more stories that are ready for release and just haven't released yet. That's a lot of work to keep track of as an engineer. If I can complete something, and by complete, I mean have it in production and in my end user's hands, I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's truly done. So 2023, let's talk about where we were and why it was so frustrating. We were using org-based development. So with that comes the traditional Salesforce shop of, we have these long-lived sandboxes that we're deploying to. It is kind of the original paradigm of you have a dev sandbox, a team sandbox, QA sandbox, staging sandbox, and a production environment. And then everything metadata wise kind of gets lumped together into one directory, and it kind of looks like a junk drawer. I mean, it's still working. All of your metadata is there, but you don't really have a sense of who owns what the purpose of all of the metadata is. There's no clear boundaries on functionality from an app perspective. And it gets very time consuming. I mean, as I said, earlier when we were comparing the times, like we spent in 2023 over 4 hours just doing or 4,000 hours doing deployments. And if you do the math on that, that's 2 engineers full time for a year in terms of time spent just doing our deploys. That includes, failed deploys, redoing the deploys, stuff like that. And it gets challenging to roll back. Again, I said we have no clear boundaries of the applications that are in the orgs. Um, so when you do a rollback, you don't know the scope that you need to do a rollback, because if everything is in one package, one directory, if it's just the giant junk drawer, getting things back to a previous state is very challenging. And I would make the argument that this requires a technical skill set to do to actually even initiate the releases, because it's a complete shared environment with no clear boundaries around it. 2024, we essentially organized our junk drawer. That's the topic of this presentation. It's what the SFOps framework encourages and allows you to, save time, release with confidence. It's all about organization. With that, we get fresh dev and QA environments. So we're getting sandboxes. We are not scratch org enabled at this time. We are using fresh sandboxes that are cloned every couple of hours. We're using source control, so everything's stored in GitHub. And things are very modular. And I like this picture because it shows you the previous slide. We had the junk drawer. Everybody probably has a junk drawer in their house or apartment where they just throw things and it becomes a catch-all. When things are organized in a way with clear boundaries where things are related, it becomes easier to find things, change things, move things around. And that's the same type of approach that we took here at Coinbase by implementing the SFOps framework. It becomes easy to roll back when you know the boundaries of your application. And with the specific implementation of SFOps, it makes it very, very simple to release. You can do it in 2 clicks. Basically what happens when we're talking about releasing and why it's so easy and you have a lot of confidence, you get this dashboard view of a release. And pre-merge, ultimately what happens, you get a fresh environment that's a couple of hours old. You run all of the relevant tests. You get peer and domain owner review. And also with those fresh environments, you can actually have your end users go straight into it with 1 click and test directly on it. After it's merged, an artifact gets created. We do a test deploy to a QA environment, and then you get a candidate, and that's what you can see here. And it tells you exactly what's in that candidate and from a story perspective and where it currently is. So in this hypothetical scenario here, I could initiate a release that's 1 story or 2 stories based off of where those stories are in terms of being tested and if they're releasable or not. And it becomes very, very simple. I said 2 clicks. You go into the initiate release, click initiate, and then it's done and ready to actually be released there. Very, very simple. Ultimately, this supports the North Star of what we're trying to do here at Coinbase. From a Salesforce engineering perspective, we want to have this set up where at the beginning of a day, engineer goes and gets the story off of a backlog. Doesn't necessarily matter what that story is. It's just a new story to be done that day. We leverage an AI assistant, and you can rapidly complete that story from a development perspective in a fresh development environment. Key there, it's fresh, so it's got all of the most recent releases, all of the most recent metadata, and then I basically build it and put up a PR. In that PR, we do several layers of review, whether that's peer review, code owner review, and then also getting testing, our end users actually involved right there, also in a fresh environment that's a couple of hours old. Once all of those things pass, we go through the feedback loop of both testing and review. I merge to main, and then potentially automatically deploy to production within the hour. So this idea of I start my day as an engineer getting a story, I work through it, get reviews, give it to my end users, and by the end of the day, it's in production. This is the North Star that we are following. We're not necessarily there on the automatic production deploys, but the steps that we've taken with the SFOps framework have put us really, really close to that. And so we're confident that we can do that potentially in the next year or so. So that all sounds great. I'm sure a lot of you are probably like, yeah, I'd love to do that, but it sounds really challenging. I've got an old org. It's got a ton of metadata in it. I've got a lot of teams with varying skill sets. So how do I get there? the important thing to do is just one step at a time get there. And it comes down to organization. So SFOps and Flexible define basically two levels of organization when it comes to your metadata. So in your main directory, when you do an extract, you typically could have everything just in that main default directory of all your metadata there, and that's the junk drawer. You can start organizing things in domains and packages. So a domain is just a collection of related packages, very simple. And you can think of that as just a swim lane that's basically your direct path to production. So I could put a series of related packages that are tied to specific business functionality. And then the idea is that if I'm making changes to those packages, I have a dedicated release swim lane straight to production. And then packages, it's the traditional sense of this is just related metadata that lives together. So packages have been around in one form or another for a very long time in Salesforce. That doesn't change here. The addition is the idea of a domain. So we give it one layer of abstraction. And typically we see kind of a one-to-one mapping of domain ownership to a team. So you can almost think of a domain as a team. And then a team owns a set of packages, and that's what they're ultimately working on and releasing to production day in and day out. And again, we're talking about how to get there. This was how we looked in November of 2022. This represents our one package that has everything in it. So this represented our thousands of pieces of metadata. There was no organization by team. It was just that junk drawer I keep talking about. All of the metadata lived in there, and that's why it was challenging. We started talking about domains and packages on how to organize them. And the important thing is that with the SFOps framework, you don't have to be perfect on this. You can ultimately just start defining your domains and packages by just moving things from one directory to the other. So taking things out of that giant package, that original extract, I define a domain. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it your team name if you wanted to, and then start defining your packages and dropping the metadata in there, and that becomes your dedicated release swim lane. And so at that point, because you're working off of sandboxes that are fresh, you don't have to necessarily worry about dependencies. It's going to deploy. It's kind of like an org dependent unlock package, but it allows you to try different things from an organization perspective. You can create a domain and you can define a bunch of packages in it, and maybe those packages don't work. You can scrap those, create new packages, create new domains, but it's really just about trying to pull things out and finding the proper home for things. And again, it comes down to thinking about how you would organize a junk drawer, right? Like you look at a massive mess of things inside of a junk drawer, you don't immediately know how you're going to organize everything. The important thing is that you just start doing it. You start putting things in little sections here and there, and over time you work your way through the entire drawer, and ultimately at the end you have a fully organized drawer that way. You can take the same approach with SFOps and do that with your domains and packages here. Um, Ultimately, you end up with something that looks like this. So each of the colors represents a domain, and each of the small rectangles in it represents a package. And I say end-ish because this is kind of it's a never-ending project. As requirements change over time, as new features become enabled, you're just constantly kind of moving things in and out of packages. It's kind of fun from an engineering perspective to tinker on it, experiment with new domains, experiment with new packages. But you ultimately get this view where there's a lot of little pieces to the org, and that's what you can actually release. So you can think about, we previously had one giant package and one release swim lane. Now we have about 7 to 8 here. And within each of those, there's several packages. Like in this red one here, there's 15, 20 or so packages that exist. And something you can see as well is they took one step with their domain. So they defined a domain, and then they put a whole lot of metadata into that domain. So they made a giant package within that domain. That gave them one step closer because now they had a large but unorganized chunk of metadata that they were pretty confident was theirs. And then they could start moving it from that big package within the domain to smaller packages within the domain. And I call that out because the important thing here is to keep trending in the right direction, keep tinkering, keep trying. and understand that you're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's okay because you're ultimately moving towards a smaller and more modular org, and that's ultimately what you want to do. Once we were able to do that, that really opens up the testing workflow here. And this is kind of the magic of SFOps. As Autumn said, the entire point of the framework is to shift left as far as possible. So if we talk about 2023, again, we had that dated paradigm. We were doing functional testing in shared out-of-date environments. We had less confidence in tests because of drift over time. I mean, the longer a sandbox exists, the more likely that tweaks or unfinished stories or random changes happen in it, and ultimately you end up with an environment that doesn't necessarily match source. It doesn't match production. It's just drifted over time. And then we were also in a state where we were selecting our unit tests manually or doing a full test run. We didn't have an intelligent way of selecting our unit tests. With SFOps, basically the sandbox mechanisms give us functional testing in a fresh environment that matches our staging and production environment very, very closely. And that gives us high confidence because these environments are fresh. I can't stress this enough. Changes are made, and then a sandbox is spun up. The latest, some of these sandboxes that we're getting in our PRs, which we'll get into in just a minute here, they're potentially at most 3 to 4 hours old, which compared to some of our old environments, some of our old test environments that were measured in years, not hours, they're very, very fresh. And something that's really cool about the SFOps framework is it automatically selects the unit tests that are relevant to your change. So you push changes to a package, and it's smart enough to figure out exactly what unit tests within your org need to run in order to accurately and confidently test the change that you just made. Again, we're trying to shift left as far as we can. So this is a screenshot from a PR. So as a developer, I go in and I create my PR when my change is ready. A review sandbox is basically checked out and assigned to this PR, and we run all of those unit tests on it. But we also have the capability to go in and functionally test here. So this is where we can actually do UAT. And I want to call out that we are doing user acceptance testing, as in the act of putting our end users in here and signing off on it. And this avoids the need for a true dedicated UAT environment. So we can do that testing. We can put our end users in here, get the features in their hands quickly before we've even merged to main, and we can get sign off here. So then we've got a PR that's ready to go that has our unit tests passing. And we can see this here. We have our unit test passing. We have a peer review. We have a domain owner, which could be a team lead. It's really just a code owner. And then we also have functional testing from our end user signed off. And so at this point, this change we have confidence in because we've tested it basically on all levels of the pyramid, and we're ready to merge it. And once we merge it, we can more or less just send this thing straight to our staging and production environments because it's basically been pre-tested. So we have a lot of confidence in this because of everything that we've done until this point. Again, releasing confidence. All of that stuff happened before we get to this screen here. And I know I showed it earlier, but the idea of I've created this PR, I've ran a bunch of relevant unit tests that were selected automatically by the framework, and I've put the feature in the hands of my end users, and then I've had multiple levels of review, code review. By this point, I merge it and a release candidate gets created. I have so much confidence in this change that I can just send it straight to a staging environment. We actually have it set up in one of our orgs where we don't even require an approval to go to a staging environment. Once it's merged to main, they initiate a release, it just automatically deploys straight to that staging environment. So no approvals necessary. And then from there, they're more or less doing just a smoke test to make sure that the metadata was deployed successfully. A lot of times we actually have approval to do a staging and production deploy simultaneously because, again, this is all about confidence. We've shifted left as far as we can. We've done all this pre-work to basically be super confident in that change. And now at this point, releasing is more or less a formality because we have such a high degree of confidence there. And then this is the basically dashboard that you can look at when you get the SFOps framework that basically gives you a complete bird's eye view into what's going on in your pipeline. So you can look at things like if you look at the top left, that's our PR turnaround time. So right now, PR gets put out there, takes about 4 days to get released. You can look at how long it takes to do the checks that I showed previously, so those validations that happen automatically. You could talk about the PR validation success ratio, so like how often are we submitting a PR and is that validation running successfully? It's red, 77% is not great, but you can view that as a good thing because it's catching things in advance. So developers are creating things in a dev sandbox, they're spinning up a PR, and then that validation is happening and it's catching things right then and there, and that's super cheap because then all they have to do is go fix the change. Maybe they forgot to grab a piece of metadata from their dev sandbox and commit it. Maybe they had a setting that they had to do in their dev sandbox that they didn't, that needs to be done in the review sandbox. Sometimes you're even catching bugs across Salesforce releases in this instance, but this ultimately gives them a very cheap way to catch bugs and fix them. And then what you should see ultimately, we talked about that test QA deployment. We have a staging deploy, and then we have a production deploy. And you should see that percentage go up as you get further up the pipeline. This is an example of the past month in one of our orgs. And I want to call attention here to this bottom right box, which is the end-to-end release workflow. And this is basically the time that from the time a developer or anybody who initiates a release goes in to the time it's actually in production. So we talked about the point where developers actually go in and initiate those releases. Those happen after merge. So post merge, you can initiate a release. After you initiate a release, within 7 hours, you're actually in production at that point. And so that's super fast. Previously, we were measuring this in days versus hours. And so now we're trying to get even faster than that. Some of this is because there's some manual approvals by platform team to go in and actually approve the deploys and validate a couple of things. And so we can drive that metric down over time and get that faster back to the North Star of how quickly we can actually get things out into production with confidence. Ultimately, that's all I have. I wanted to open the floor for questions. We can revisit any of the things I talked about. But yeah, thank you for listening. I think I needed Oslam to come back. I can start fielding questions here. I see one. Have we vetted tools like Flowsum or Capado? Capado is actually what we were on before. So that was the tool that we were spending 4,000 plus hours a year doing deployments with. When we switched to SFOps, that's when we cut that deployment time in half. Hey, awesome.
Hey, can you hear me?
Sure can.
All right, fantastic. So I think there is a couple of things. There is another question as well, John. How do you spin up a connector dog in such low time? A lot of requirements are not Salesforce only, and they involve integration testing.
Sure, that's a great question. Currently, with the setup, we don't have a solution for that, and that's why we still have our staging environment that's fully integrated. So some of our stories do require some type of integration testing. And so it goes to our staging environment, and that's where the integration is tested.
Cool. All right, John, can you switch off your video integration? I think we have a few more questions coming up. Screen sharing.
Sure.
Yeah, fantastic. All good. So there is a question from Nantray. Did I understand correctly? You mentioned to spin up sandboxes, not scratch jokes. So why did
Yes.
you decided to take the sandbox route as opposed to scratch jokes?
So one, um, ultimately, it does not matter what environments you're using as long as they are fresh. Um, we have a sandbox mechanism built in via SFOps that's creating basically a sandbox pool that are functionally equivalent to Scratchworks. Um, it's very challenging to get your metadata dependencies right. I'm sure every engineer who's ever tried to tackle this problem with an existing org that's multiple years old, getting things just to deploy correctly to a scratch org is a challenge in and of itself. So our orgs right now are not capable of being deployed to a scratch org necessarily. So we have a sandbox solution for now as we are, again, I talked about moving metadata around in between the packages and domains as we figure out the releases. We want to ultimately get to a state where everything's deploying to a scratch org, because if you can deploy to a scratch org, that represents a level of maturity in your dependency management that um, ultimately is the right way to do things, because you have kind of this top to bottom tree. You don't have any circular dependencies and things like that. It's just very challenging to get there. But once you get there, you have the scratch orgs. It forces you to keep that level of maturity. And so we want to ultimately do that, but it's going to be a longer journey. Now, the SFOps sandbox mechanism basically gives us, I would say, 95% of the benefits of scratch orgs without the challenges of managing the metadata dependencies that scratchworks force you to do.
All right, cool. So, John, how do you? So you had sandboxes, right? What was the lessons that you learned while you were, basically doing sandboxes at scale, right? So I think you pretty much had nearly around 150 sandboxes in a day that is being getting recreated and so forth, right? What are the issues that you guys were running into?
Um, Mostly when people are moving pieces of metadata out of domains that they don't own. That's when things got challenging. And that's why it's important when that's why I love the like domain and package model, because domain more or less defines ownership. It's kind of in the name of what a domain is. It's kind of your little fiefdom of metadata. When people are moving things in and out of domains with no approvals, that's when things got challenging.
Right.
Um, Outside of that, I mean, the sandbox clone mechanism works well most of the time. Sandboxes ultimately get cloned from a snapshot sandbox that we have set up in the majority of the time, an hour or less, and we have those pooled and ready for review. Um, I mean, in terms of challenges, very little. Scratch orgs, on the other hand, very, very challenging to get right, because, again, you have to manage those metadata dependencies. And sometimes those take a long time because you build this metadata dependency tree, you deploy a bunch of things in a row, in a row, in a row, and it's like the last thing or the second to last thing that ends up failing because you didn't manage your dependencies right.
I see. Then I think one of the common questions that often comes across John in our community is, what do you do with test data? So I think Nicholas also has the question, like, how do you manage test data across these environments, or when you do a review environment, right? How challenging is that? Like, what's your test data strategy for this particular initiative? Yeah.
That's a great question. So the way that the sandbox pools work in SFOps is that it's a clone operation. So you create a snapshot sandbox. It's getting a deploy at the same time as the QA box, so it stays in sync. And if you put data in that snapshot sandbox, it automatically flows to the dev sandboxes and the review sandboxes. And so you have to take some time there ultimately and ask the development teams and maybe their stakeholders, like, what are the relevant test cases that you're using in staging, or what are you when you're going in and doing user acceptance testing, what records are you using in staging? Maybe they're doing a little bit of testing in production sometimes as well, but getting an idea of what those records are, putting them in the snapshot sandbox, and then it automatically flows to those development and review environments. So then they're available to be used.
Right, right, right. All good. Um, the other question, John, is that one of the most common confusion is when do you want to get into this way of doing things? How important is modularization? Right? You touched upon your junk drawer analogy and how do you want to do it? But why is it important in the grand scheme of things? Like, why do you need to really modularize it?
Yeah, because when things are in that initial state, the junk drawer model, you as a team don't really understand like the boundaries and the scope of your applications. I mean, I've seen some orgs that are really old where something is named that's application specific, but it's been around so long it's kind of made its way into org level infrastructure, and you have no context or knowledge that this is actually a really important piece of metadata that's not application specific anymore. So if you can shrink down the boundaries of the packages in your applications, then you have a clear and accurate understanding of like what your team actually owns versus what your team does not own. And that's where the advantage comes in. Because again, when you're trying to look at 10,000 pieces of metadata that maybe you've been at the company for a couple of years, the Salesforce org is 10 plus years old, it's got 100,000 pieces of metadata in it. There's no way you can go in there and accurately figure out exactly what it is that's within the scope of your application. But if you come into an org that has things organized in packages and domains, you have a really clear understanding of like what you own and what you should change as part of what you're trying to do from an engineering perspective.
I think this is also very important. And Andre also had a similar question, right? So when you run this at scale, when you operate it, um, how do you deal with confusions, right? So me as a dev, I'm working on a piece of component. I don't know where to slot it. So I'm confused on which domain might it belong to. So what is your process like? Do you I think we discussed this in the past, right? But how do you do that? Do you mention that in your Jira story? Does things have changed after that? So how do you guys interact as a team together to decide where to go and like what's the process like for that?
Sure. So one, back to domains go hand in hand with ownership. There are engineers who are in the code owners file defined as the owners for that metadata. And so if I'm an engineer and I'm building new metadata, or maybe I'm pulling things out of one domain into another, um, when I put up that PR, one is going to automatically request their review on it. If I move something out of one domain into another domain, that's going to trigger a change in both domains, and all of the domain owners are going to have to go look at that PR. And you're going to have to get approvals from at least one of the sets of domain owners in each domain in order to even get that thing merged. But if there's genuine questions on what I should do, we have a dedicated Slack channel. It's around DevOps where it's free conversation. We have a dedicated Slack channel that's just domain owners, where it's a smaller audience where we can talk about the organization of things and maybe some innovation type efforts to reorganize packages, reorganize domains, and you can kind of spitball before you actually go implement that. But it's important to over communicate in this, like say, hey, and sometimes I've noticed engineers are afraid to do this because you don't want to be wrong in your attempt to define a package or a domain. But I have, like, there's an inherent fear to do it, but then I've also seen on the flip side, nobody has ever been shamed or gotten in trouble for trying to define a package or a domain. There may be some pushback or some alternatives suggested, but that behavior of defining a new package or moving things to another package or creating a new domain, maybe it's even a shared domain across teams, that behavior is always met with enthusiasm and encouragement. Not one time has there ever been pushback of no, you shouldn't do that or you're not allowed that. That's allowed behavior for every engineer at every level here at Coinbase, um, because ultimately it's viewed as you're trying to take ownership of your org and you're trying to put it in a better spot than where you found it, and so that behavior is encouraged. Just keep trying to do it and over communicate and explain why you're trying to do it.
So what is a governance structure like that in Coinbase, John, at this moment, right? So is there a team that governs this process, or is it self-governing teams working together?
So back to the code owners, right? So we kind of live and die by the code owners of the domain. Um, so there's 2 to 3 engineers per domain that ultimately say yes or no. There's also the platform team, my team, which is listed as the code owner on every single domain that can approve in place of the other domain owners, or maybe there's a particularly sensitive piece of code that has to get approval from the platform domain and things like that. But ultimately, it just comes down from having a really good code ownership model.
Fantastic. And John, couple of more questions before I let you leave. How disruptive was this whole process, right? So, looking back at your journey, coming from an org-based model into package or a modular development model, right? So one of the typical challenges that we see in the community is that it's said it's very hard to adopt it. You need to train your devs, admins, who is involved, and especially when you talk about this review orgs, it's also completely a new concept, right? You're trying to shift your all UAT testing into individual sandboxes, right? So
Mhm.
how disruptive was this whole change? How long did it took for you guys to really move into that? And what was the behind the scenes of this movement?
Sure. So in terms of actual like implementation of the SFOps framework, that ultimately is done in about a week's worth of engineering time. In terms of like the setback or learning curve, time spent doing that, that's measured in weeks. In our first org that we did this in, I would say it took about 4 weeks for us to get right. Part of that was because there was an issue with the sandbox clone operation that we had to open a case with Salesforce with. Kind of hard to figure out how to use a pipeline if you can't get a healthy sandbox pool going. But still, even with that, that was done in a month when we did a rollout. And that was back in January. We did another rollout for our other org in July. It took us 2 weeks to basically get it fully implemented and all the domains defined. And then everything was flowing more or less within the week after that. So 4 weeks on one, 3 weeks on another. And it's important to note that development was still occurring while we were doing the rollout and implementation. It was just more or less being piled up um, with the old way. In the first rollout, basically stored in their old team sandboxes. In the second one, they were on source control. They were more or less just creating PRs and waiting for the updated main branch for them to pull from and rebase and then get things moved up the pipeline. So
Right.
stuff was still happening. It just wasn't necessarily releasable. But 4 weeks for the first one, and I'd say 3 weeks for the second one.
Yeah. And how do you get your business stakeholders to um, go across this idea that you can come into GitHub and view anything and do it, right? Because the most often the notion in the Salesforce ecosystem is to do UAT testing in an UAT environment. It's a dedicated piece of environment, and that's where you have user personas, test data, and everything loaded up. And often we have seen pushbacks from business that I can't go and test an environment that keeps on changing. So how did you get that buy-in in your organization?
Well, it's about lack of friction, right? Your end users don't care what Salesforce org they're testing in; they just care that it's easy. And so if you have your test data that's flowing into your review boxes, the records they're familiar with are there for them to test on. And then the SFOps framework publishes a comment on the PR with a one-click login. And I think that's an important key right there is it's very easy to get into the org, and then I can see the records I'm familiar with, and then I can provide sign off right then and there. Like it's just very easy. It's like having our staging org is enabled with SSO. One of the reasons that it's so great is because you could just go into it. You don't have to remember a username. You don't have to remember a password. You just click a tile. You go in, mess around with the records you're familiar with, and then you sign off on the JIRA ticket. Well, that's the exact same process that's happening in the review boxes, except it's from a PR, not all the way up at the environment that's right before production.
Right. So there's one question from Wu, John. Have you had any major obstacles managing sandbox pools during release windows? We know that calendar, when the release window is out, there are a couple of preview sandboxes, non-preview sandboxes, and in Scratch Jobs, of course, you can control that using the preview and non-preview and all the stuff. Like, how did you guys manage that for sandbox pools?
Yeah. I mean, to be transparent, we've had some difficulties around that. Um, the sandbox clone operation around releases has slowed down several times, and we opened a case with Salesforce, demonstrated that it was working 45 minutes or less a week ago. Now we're talking about release issues or release related functionality, and now it's taking 2 to 3 hours to create, and that ultimately drives Salesforce to make an improvement there. And so the more people who are trying to leverage these more advanced features for sandbox management, the more, I guess, care will be taken to them and the more prioritization they'll be given. Because if everybody was suddenly leveraging the sandbox clone operation all the time to create fresh sandboxes like we're doing with this framework, that becomes a very important feature. Right now, I don't think it's necessarily leveraged a whole lot. It may be leveraged by companies, but if they're doing the long-lived environments, then they're not hitting that 50, 100 times a day like we are. But if suddenly every customer was doing that, that becomes a very important feature. And it ultimately just requires communities to come in and say, hey, this is our expectation. You, this is a feature that's published. We use it all the time. And as the release comes every time, it gets slower. That's not okay. Um, I will say in this past release, knock on wood, because it was also around Dreamforce, we didn't really see a slowdown in the clone operation. So that the first two releases of the year we did.
Yeah.
This last release we did not.
Yeah. We have another question. You mentioned about AI assistants. What are the shifts of traditional Scrum team roles that you're seeing, and what is the team structure looking like with those things coming in play?
Our teams haven't changed with an AI assistant. It just comes around to helping build things more quickly. So doing all the scaffolding to get things spun up and then putting in your logic where you need it. Like it hasn't, you know, fundamentally changed the teams at all.
Right. Does it have any acceleration on your team? Are you seeing the benefits of adoption yet?
Too soon to tell. It's very early in the process here, taking a look at several products there, and uh, that is a pretty big paradigm shift, right? Of like instead of sitting there and building and writing and kind of being heads down on something, more or less being conversational with something and trusting the output and reviewing the output very early on that process. That's why I mentioned it in the North Star because we're trying to tackle this from both ends, right? Like release things quickly in an automated way, but also build things quickly in an almost automated way.
And what is your next part of the journey, right? What are you looking at? Like what things improving and what are the kinds of features or what are your priorities in the space?
Sure. So one of the things we really want to tackle in 2025 is the human element of approvals to production deploys. So being able to assess the health of a domain, the health of a package, the risk of a change, and combining those two together and say, hey, this is a low risk change on a domain that's super healthy. There's no real need to have a human go in and approve this because, hey, this domain has had 99% success deployment rate in the past month. This is a change that happened. And it's listed as a low risk change. It's got full test coverage. Doesn't need a human. So less time spent on approving those deploys that will help stop potentially a pileup because if everyone's requesting releases at the same time to production, there's one team that's going in and actually approving those, and obviously you can only deploy one thing at a time to an individual Salesforce environment. So in some capacity, they do have to queue up. But if we can get something that's automatically approving those deploys and sending it off when it's requested, then we save some time in that regard.
That sounds exciting, and at the same time, it's a big shift, right? So going from an approval-driven process into something that system automated is. Cool. I think that's pretty much I have. Let me check here. Um, yeah, that was I think one question from Nicholas. The last one, I think we can take that. How do you deliver data configuration to production? Is it manual right now, or is it handled automatically?
Um, so like, I guess I don't understand the question. Is it like
It's
generating
more
records?
Yeah, it's more about I don't think you guys had that much of an issue. If I remember, I think it's all about the the configuration data for managed packages like DocuSign and all this stuff, right? So is it handled through the pipeline yet?
Um, I mean, I can speak from like a general manual post deployment step perspective, and that's more of a culture of pushing back on any manual step that's listed and trying to find a way to script it. So even if you're still manual, like maybe you're going into the anonymous window and running Apex as part of a manual step for your deployment, if you're at least able to do that, then that opens up the door to potentially having that automatically run pre or post deployed down the road. If you're constantly allowing things to be in a manual step, go click on this, set this value, click on this, set this value, that doesn't leave the door open to having a fully automated deploy. If you push back and say, I mean, custom metadata is a great example. There's a lot of times where you have like a generic key value pair metadata, like go set, I'm releasing this, go set this custom metadata record afterwards to this value. Well, you can do that via Apex. You can do a call out and change the metadata from the anonymous window. And so by pushing back on the engineers and saying, find a way to script this, that keeps the door open and keeps us moving in the right direction. And that's kind of the theme of everything SFOps related is it gives you that capability to keep taking steps forward towards your North Star. And so you take that from both a tooling perspective and a mindset perspective, and you put those together, and then next thing you know, you've actually achieved your North Star.
Fantastic. I think that's all what we have for today. Thanks, John, for sharing all those insights, and thanks for using the flexible framework, especially SFOps. And it's great to have associated with you guys. It was a fantastic journey as well. Thank you. Thanks a lot, John. Thanks for your time.
Awesome. No problem.
And
Thanks for having me.
thank you everyone for joining this event. So we had some technical issues with LinkedIn Live, so we'll be posting this video on the YouTube channels and all the stuff and sharing the links to you. Cool. Thank you.